Thank you, Sewell. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Austin. Happy to have you here. Hi, Dean.
I can turn this on. How are you? Am I on? Let's see. Thank you. How are you? It's great to be here. Great to be back in Austin.
Thank you so much for being here, and we're excited to have the opportunity to talk about, I hope, a couple things. I want to talk about first, for the first part of this conversation, the Local Investigations Fellowship that you're going to lead now at the Times, and then I want to talk about a range of things related to the world we're living in, journalism, the Times, and I'm going to ask you what your Wordle score was this morning. Mine was 4.
I did it on the second try this morning. It was good.
You got a 2?
Yeah. That's pretty unusual.
I'm tempted to dive into this, but it would ruin the Wordle for everybody else. There was an aspect to the solution today that the Times often, it pisses me off. Anyway, we'll get to that. So whose idea was the Local Investigations Fellowship?
It was actually the publisher's idea.
Say more.
So the tradition at the New York Times is the executive editor steps down at 65, or the year you turn 65. Right. And as I got closer to 65, he threw out this idea, partly because we liked working together, and wanted to continue working together.
You were going to stay at the Times regardless? Were you thinking that you might leave?
No, I actually didn't know. Yeah, frankly. I mean, I didn't know what the future. I was so focused on news. I was so focused on the Times. I was so focused on the newsroom. I hadn't thought about what I would do next, and I think I was in a little bit of denial, not only because I was about to hit 65. Everybody about to hit 65 is in a little bit of denial. So it was partly that, partly I'd spent my whole life in newsroom since I was 19, so I didn't know. And he threw out this idea, and I immediately loved it. First off, I grew up in local journalism. Secondly, I've spent, I guess, much of my career as an investigative reporter. Thirdly, I actually feel like I owe something to journalism. I mean, I grew up in a working poor neighborhood in New Orleans and I've seen so much of the world as a journalist, and I want journalism, and local journalism in particular, to survive and thrive, and anything I can do to contribute to that would make me very happy.
So you've just thrown that, that's great, absolutely, sure. Anytime anybody says something positive or uplifting about journalism, clap. That is your job today and all weekend. So the applications have just been thrown open for this. It seemed curious timing that it was right before you were going to be here. I'm sure that was only a coincidence. Yeah. They're going to be accepted on a rolling basis with the idea that the folks chosen for this Investigations Fellowship will begin work early next year. Right. I'm just going to sort of pressure test all the things I understand about this. How many people will the Times be accepting in this program?
We went into it with the idea that we would start with 10 or 12 and grow from there. Right. The one thing I've learned, I've spent a lot of the last month talking to editors in other newsrooms, and I want to see what kind of projects are proposed. So I might even go a little bit fewer or a little bit more. It depends on the projects, because the proposition is we will ourselves, me and the editors in the group, will spend a lot of time with the reporters. So my friends at ProPublica warned me, don't overdo it the first year. So, but the goal is to, anywhere from 8 to 12, and then grow from there.
I realize that the Times has all the money, but
some of the money.
But what have you budgeted for this project?
I never actually talk specific budget, so I'm going to pass on that. But it's enough to have.
Well, that's not very transparent, Dean.
No, it's not. Well, I'm not. I think the goal.
You came all this way.
I think the goal is to have about 10 people in my group. Right. Me and about 8 or 9, 10 other editors who will edit the stories and also use the resources of the Times whenever we need to.
And the theory of the case here is that you're going to bring in people and pay their salaries and benefits for the course of the year. So in fact, my question was a little unfair, because you can't tell me how much you intend to spend until you pick the fellows and you do the math.
That's right. The fellows, by the way, will stay in their local communities. I mean, the goal, if the goal is not to have them come into the New York Times newsroom, that we'll edit them and spend time with
but
them.
you said they'll make periodic trips for support and for training.
Yes, that's right.
Right.
That's right.
But they're going to be based back in those local communities.
That's right.
And this is a 1-year fellowship.
Yeah. With the one thing I came away understanding is a little bit of flexibility. It's hard to know whether an investigation takes 1 year, or
Right.
if they slop over. I think it's to get the story done.
Right. And so the criteria here, as I understand them, it can be someone who's on staff at a local news organization,
That's
or
right.
it can be a freelancer. You don't have to be associated in a formal way
That's
with an
right.
institution.
That's right.
Right? I'm assuming that you're going to take applications and accept applications from people at for-profit as well as nonprofit local news organizations.
Yes, that's right.
Right? My read, it says local papers or digital local news. It doesn't say broadcast. Was that a deliberate omission?
I thought, frankly, I don't have the expertise, and the people I was assembling for the first year didn't have the expertise to do
Yeah.
broadcast. I don't know what happens after a couple of years, but I wanted to stick, frankly, to what I could teach.
Right. So initially, broadcast is excluded. If you
That's
come
right.
from a broadcast operation, you're excluded.
That's right.
It also specifically calls out early career, and it defines early career. There are various places where information about this project various places where they're published. So one of those places said minimum of 3 years of professional experience.
Right.
So right out of school, no.
Yeah, I think, look, you have to have a specific idea. So you had to have done enough reporting for us to believe, when we're willing to take a risk, but for us to believe that you have a story. You can't just say, I think my mayor sucks, I want to spend a year proving it. And I think that takes a little bit of experience to pull off.
Right, but of course, that's interesting that you say that you have to have an idea, you have to have some sense of whether the idea can be pulled off. But you have actually said specifically, and I was kind of shocked that this was all you were asking for. This is the actual language from your website. Please limit each pitch to 500 words. I can't even limit one of my questions to 500 words. We're not looking for polished story ideas. Instead,
right.
your answers to these questions will help us assess where you are in the reporting process and what editorial support and resources the fellowship could offer. It sounds like you actually aren't requiring an enormous amount on the front end on the idea.
That's right.
Yeah.
And look, the goal is to do work that would not have been done if we didn't come in and help.
Right.
So the thought of somebody who's already got like 5 of a 6-part series reported out already, I'm not sure what we bring to the table.
Right. Are you going to vet both the people and if they're associated with an institution on the ground, the institution?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by vet. We're not going to ask for their credit card information.
No, but you know what I mean. I mean, somebody
Yes,
shows up,
yes,
person you never
that's
know,
right.
don't know, haven't heard of, shows up as an
Yes.
applicant. Clearly,
We
you're
want
going to do due diligence. on this.
absolutely,
Is this
yes.
somebody we want to invest in?
Yes, that's right.
Literally, the last word of one of the websites associated with this fellowship is the word diverse. It is also the only place that diverse or anything related to equity, diversity, appears anywhere in this
Right.
project's description. Last word. We want to ensure that the nation's core of investigative journalists grows and becomes more diverse. How are you prioritizing diversity in the application process?
So I was an investigative reporter for the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, the Chicago Tribune, and the New York Times. And for a long time, frankly, I would go to conferences, and I was the only black investigative reporter I saw. I saw very few women. I saw very few Asian Americans, Latinos, etc. So things are better today. So the goal is to make sure that a lot of the fellows, it's hard to put a number on, I haven't even seen the application, but that a lot of the fellows have diverse backgrounds. Because, frankly, one of the greatest things that I've seen as I visit newsrooms over the last couple months and as I talk to editors is that every newsroom, particularly some of the newer newsrooms, are working very hard at diversity. So I want to make sure to help some of those people become investigative reporters or learn how to be investigative beat reporters.
So, and to that point, you say specifically in the context of this project, I would love to have the chance to help train a new generation of investigators.
Right.
You do see this really as bringing people to school.
Yes, exactly.
Talk about that.
Well, that's why the goal is. So I've spent the last month or two with Sona Patel, who's one of my colleagues, and Chris Davis, who we just hired from Gannett, talking to newsrooms, visiting newsrooms, and there's so many people who have the desire to do investigative work. Their editors are overwhelmed.
Yeah.
They don't quite know how to do it. They actually have a lot of stuff. I mean, we've actually worked with some reporters informally already, and they're like, they actually have the stuff of a story. They can land a story. They don't have as much time. The editors don't have as much time. They're young. They're hungry. They're what I was at the Times-Picayune, and I want to help that person get the story done, and preferably stay in that community and keep doing those stories.
So this is teaching a man to fish in
That's right.
in the
That's
glib,
That's right.
cliched construction rather than giving a man a fish. You
That's
want to
right.
basically help this person who comes to you do this work and then send them off
That's
to
right.
go then do this work on the basis of what they've learned in,
That's
in,
right.
in perpetuity.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so what are you looking for specifically? You say local stories that hold power to account and that will take a few months to report. It can include investigations into government agencies and officials or local corporations. So
right.
standard accountability, hold
That's
the people in power, taxpayer-funded institutions accountable, overturn rocks. Tell us what you find.
That's right.
Pretty straightforward.
Classic investigative reporting.
Right. You're going to visit newsrooms, you say, in some cases, to help shape proposals. I'm interested in this. First of all, which newsrooms? How will you determine which newsrooms you're going to visit? And if this is really about the investigative reporter and not about the institution, why do you need to work in collaboration with the newsrooms?
Because some of the editors we talked to said they don't have time to come up with proposals.
It's that bad.
Yeah, there are these. You all have spent time in newsrooms. They're overworked. The last thing they want to do is spend time, applying for this. That's one thing. I also think, frankly, some of the newsrooms we've talked to, the editors and the reporters are not, well, particularly the reporters, are not advanced enough to know what they have. So, and frankly, some of this is selfish. I like being in newsrooms.
Right.
I like being on the front end of stories. I like sitting down with a reporter who has a half-formed idea and trying to figure out what it could look like at the other end. So one of the goals, and I also have developed over the course of this a little bit of a goal that I didn't expect to develop, which is, frankly, I think that it's been helpful for the newsrooms we talk to just talk to editors who have a little bit of time. And for the first time in my career, I have a little bit of time.
So the articles that are produced through this fellowship, I was very interested in this. The articles are going to be published in the Times.
Yep, that's right.
And they're going to be made available to the local news organizations associated with this individual, and presumably ones in the community not associated with the individual, to be published. So the Times will publish them, but the local news might publish them.
No, I think the goal should be to co-publish, especially if we do it with a news organization.
But it's not required of a newsroom that they co-publish it, right?
No.
Why wouldn't they co-publish it? Why would you send
I
your
can't
reporter?
imagine they wouldn't.
Right. I mean, to me, it seemed like it was inverted. Why would
Well-
you not build this in a way where you said, we're going to take your reporter in, we're going to pay the cost of that person's work to produce work that is done on the ground in the community, benefiting the community. The local partner in exchange has to publish it. We might publish it at the Times, but the local partner should publish it.
Right. We will definitely publish it
Yeah.
in the Times. Remember, it's open not just to institutions, but to freelancers.
Sure.
Right? So if you find a freelancer who has a wonderful idea in,
Right.
New Orleans, Chicago, whatever,
Right.
it's got to be published locally. It can't just be in the New York Times.
Right,
So
right.
we
But the
gotta
way
help
this
it.
is structured, it sounds like it could conceivably just run in the Times if no local
Yeah,
partner
that
wants
would-
to publish it,
That would be a failure to me.
as far as you're concerned. Because ultimately, the beneficiary then of this work, at least on the front end, is the Times
No.
in some ways, right? You want the local
Yeah, that would
community to
be-
be the beneficiary.
Yeah, that would be a failure to me if it's only published in the Times.
Right. How much of this is about what's lacking in local news, and how much of this is about what's lacking at the New York Times?
That's a good question.
You guys have a reputation.
Yeah. No, really?
Well, I didn't even have to finish that sentence. It didn't make a difference.
For being generous, thoughtful
Yeah.
colleagues. That's
Sure, that's exactly what it is.
so. What's the next question? Go ahead.
With awesome games in the
Yeah,
morning. The criticism, and maybe that's even too strong a word, but maybe critique is better, of the New York Times has been that you guys don't really do local news very well, and that often when you go into communities to report on things that happen there, it's like parachute in, do the story, often a very good story, parachute out. This is, in fact, something that I'm curious about,
Yeah.
if you see this as solving a problem that the Times has or that the rest of us have.
It's not solving a problem the Times has, because the way I see it, pick a city. It is not. We're not looking for a local story that can be nationalized. We're just looking for a local story. I mean, if you have a great story
Right.
about your local sheriff, frankly, that's the kind of story that's too local for the New York Times to justify doing on its own with its national staff. So it is actually more to the benefit. It is in fact mostly, if not solely, to the benefit of the local institution and the local community. We're not looking for the story that if we find it great. We're not looking for the New York Times story. We're looking for a purely local story. It does not have to have a nut graph that says this illustrates what's going on around the country, which is what we do when we parachute in to a place. So it's not, this is just for the record, this really is, the New York Times has turned a corner journalistically and financially. I think we've sort of, as much as anybody can, we've sort of figured out a future. This really is to help American journalism. That really is the goal, and that's my goal.
Right. Yeah, again, uplifting statement about journalism. Please clap. But let me stay with this for a second. So I'm imagining that there are different kinds of stories that you could do from local communities. You have a very good group of reporters in Texas, for instance, a state that I and Sewell and others in the room know well. The Uvalde shooting happens. New York Times is in the pool with the rest of us reporting on that story. That is not a local story. Technically it's local. It's a national story. Yesterday, I get a push notification from the Times. J. David Goodman, very good reporter based in Houston, has a story about permitless carry of handguns in Texas and the effects of that on, among other things, whether people feel safe, including public safety folks in the state of Texas passed that legislation. That's a national story.
That's right.
It's not a local story. The kinds of local stories that you seem to be talking about don't necessarily show up with a natural audience or constituency in the Times.
That's right. That's right.
And in fact, I know, we'll get to this in a while, from a partnership that the Tribune had and some others with the Times 12, 13 years ago. Right. You were often interested in local news as a way to build audience in those communities expressly.
Yeah.
This doesn't sound like
This is not that. This is not that.
You're not trying to build audience in the local communities where those reporters or those stories are based.
Look, if the New York Times just wanted to go do a bunch of local investigations, frankly,
you could do it.
I could send 20 New York Times reporters to do local investigations.
Right.
The reason you want to work with younger journalists is for the reason we said, to teach the next generation.
Yeah. You've answered a version of this, but I want to ask it straightforwardly to you. You mentioned that you had been an investigative reporter once upon a time yourself. You won a Pulitzer in 1988 for investigative reporting, specifically while
I was very young
at the Tribune. And you were a finalist for another Pulitzer in investigative reporting, by my math, at the Times.
That's right.
Right? You've been an editor and the editor at a paper that consistently publishes award-winning investigative journalism. You have a sense of this space. What has happened to investigative journalism over the years that we are in the state we're in, so that it is necessary for the Times to spend money to solve the problems that the rest of us are experiencing in our community?
A lot's happened. First off, newsrooms have shrunk considerably. And even the new newsrooms that have developed in the last couple of years, which are really exciting, are not big enough to say to a reporter, follow your tip, let's talk in 3 months, 4 months.
Or take 7 months, 8 months.
That is really difficult to do. So that's one thing. I also think, frankly, and this is almost like a side issue, I do fear sometimes that reporting itself gets devalued a little bit in an era when there's so much more opinion. There's so much more. I think social media invites less reporting and invites more commentary. I just think all of those things have conspired to make investigative reporting less frequent, harder. If you think back to when I started, if you look at Pulitzer nominees of 25 years ago, God, there were so many more newspapers that could produce 8, 9, 10 big.
Well, there were so many more newspapers, period.
No, that's right.
Here in Texas, I think back 25 years ago, we had the Dallas Times-Herald, we had the Houston Post, we had the San Antonio Light, we had an afternoon newspaper in El Paso probably 30 years ago. The whole landscape is different, right?
So how do you find, and when I talk to editors around the country, and they all say the same thing, I don't have time to spend a long, full day with a reporter talking to her about what she has, talking to her about where the story can go. So I think the economics, the culture a little bit, have combined to make it harder to do really good local investigative reporting.
Is this not in part a self-own? This is an obvious question. I'm sure you don't want to sit here and dunk on the big chains that have bought these papers or the hedge funds, but didn't we do this to ourselves? If you hollow out the news business and then you're shocked to discover that there were no reporters left, it's like next you're going to tell me there's gambling in Casablanca. I'm sitting here going, we did this to ourselves, right?
Yeah, we did. Though we did it to ourselves, but I'll add one caveat. I don't know what the other. I mean, frankly, I think the economics. We could do a whole panel on the economics of the news business. Some of it got done to us by forces out of our control. A lot of it we did to ourselves. But whatever, it's been done. and from where I sit, we need to figure out a remedy to get this kind of reporting done.
Spend our time finger pointing where we can actually solve the problem.
Yeah, that's right.
So I've asked you about investigative journalism. What happened to journalism more broadly? What do you think about the state of our profession? Are you bullish or bearish on journalism right now?
You know, I'm actually bullish, and I've gotten more. I can go through all the problems. You know, I've worked in newsrooms that were cutting. I've cut.
Yeah.
I've worked in newsrooms that were growing. Trust me, that's more fun. But you know, look, I've also spent time in the last, 6-7 weeks, in the time since I left the job of executive editor, talking to newsrooms that have 3 people that are like excited to come in and that are just reporting the hell out of stories. I spent 2 days in the Baltimore Banner newsroom, and it reminded me of the stateside and where I started. So I'm a realist, and I understand the economics of the news business, and I get all the forces that are pushing against this. And I also get that there are places where this is not happening, but I also see people getting into the news business in ways that they couldn't have before. I had coffee a couple months ago with 3 editors at New York Focus, which is a small newsroom in New York that's examining state government and the prison system. They do great stuff. You could not have had a small group of people that way start a news operation with that kind of focus when I started. So bullish. I might be naive because I love the business so much, but a little more bullish than I was when I started this endeavor.
Well, there's no question that in the last 25 years, the barriers to entry
That's right.
have not
right.
gone away completely, but
That's
have
right.
largely gone away.
Yeah, we also shouldn't romanticize what newspapers were like.
Right, the good old
25
days weren't that good.
No, that's right. I mean, yes, newsrooms were bigger, but not every newsroom was great. Yes, newsrooms were bigger, and
Well,
they
there was a
could
lot
cover
of bullshit masquerading as journalism in
That's
those
right.
papers. Let's be
That's
honest
right.
about
That's
it.
right. So yes, a lot of bad stuff has happened to journalism. But I also think if we keep dwelling on what was,
Right.
we won't take advantage of what could be.
I want to walk to the side of this conversation about journalism and talk more broadly about America and democracy and the role that journalism has in either creating problems or at least enabling ones not of our making. You and I are both old enough to remember, and others in the room are as well, when Pat Moynihan, the late Pat Moynihan, said, "We're all entitled to our own opinions, but we're not entitled to our own facts."
That's right.
Turns out to be a jump ball these days. Truth is not truth. Reality is a subjective construct. And I'm prepared to say, on behalf of journalism, that if you don't believe the election was legitimate, or you don't believe that COVID was legitimate, or you don't believe that climate science was legitimate, you're not entitled to your own facts. And that we have, as an industry, have an obligation to call bullshit on that.
I
don't
agree.
we? Right.
I agree.
But hasn't the problem been that not enough people have called bullshit on it in our profession? We both sides everything.
Yeah.
And we shrug our shoulders and say, well, they have an opinion. We have to give it the same weight and credibility as the other side. No, we don't. Right?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But I'll say one other thing. I do, and I go back to a point I made earlier. Our largest obligation is to prove the point, is to do the reporting. Our largest obligation is to go out and find the stories that prove the point. The Times has been criticized for both sides' journalism. Sometimes we've made mistakes. All news organizations have. I do think, frankly, that there was a period of 25, 30 years ago where everybody settled into an easy form of journalism that was sort of a little bit faux fair, F-A-U-X fair. But frankly, I do worry that we get so caught up in framing and so caught up in debates over objectivity that we've lost the sense of what the whole history of it was, which was nobody's objective. It's a system. It's not an individual's outlook, and the goal should be to understand that we need to pursue some journalistic questions. Most questions are really hard. They're not so simple. Climate is really simple. A lot of questions, racism, anti-Semitism, those are simple. a lot of the questions that sometimes get lumped in with those easier ones are really not simple. Immigration is a hard issue in America. I grew up in a very Catholic, black community in New Orleans. Abortion is a complicated issue for Americans. If we don't understand that and try to go out and report those things out and bring them to people, I think that's a dereliction of our duty too.
Let me come back to one of the things. I appreciate what you said about climate change. I appreciate the longer answer, but let me come back to the question of the election being stolen as a talking point, and as an element of so much of the conversation right now around democracy that runs smack into journalism. Jake Tapper from CNN was here in Austin at a Texas Tribune function last fall, and he said, I did not know this. He said, I will not, he at that time was hosting 2 shows on the network. I think he's now changed what he's doing. But he was at the time hosting 2 shows. And he said, I will not book anybody onto either of our shows who does not accept that the election was legitimate. I said, you have no election deniers ever as guests on your show? He said, no, none. I said, I live in Texas, right? I don't know that we could actually do the Texas Tribune if that were our standard. He said, no, we just will not do that. We won't even give airtime or oxygen to those people. Is that the job of journalism, is to say, we've decided that this thing that X number of people in the country or X number of people in office believe is not legitimate, and therefore we're just not going to simply entertain a discussion with them at all for the purposes of journalism?
I won't get into his decision because that's a different
but
thing.
tell me what yours would be in this case, and what ours should be.
I don't think you can produce a strong journalistic report if you do not have some of those voices in it. Because the goal of journalism is not to say, I don't want to hear, of course the election was not stolen. I mean, that's been proven, a million times over. But one of the goals of journalism is to explain the world. And if you don't go out and get the voices of people who, and I'm not talking about the most ludicrous, I'm not saying you should have like an anti-Semite hour.
Right.
But if we don't understand...
Be the worst radio show ever, by the way, wouldn't it?
But if we don't understand the forces that cause a huge percentage of Americans to believe that,
right,
whether it's writing about Mike Lindell, as we did in the Times this morning, if we don't understand that, so who are we writing for? And who? That's like skipping the hardest part of the job of journalism. The hardest part of the job of journalism is grappling with questions grappling with people and questions that are complicated. I don't think the question of the election was complicated, but the question of why those people believe it is complicated. And I think part of our job is to explain, how did that happen? How did so many Americans come to believe an obvious lie? And I think that's a journalistic question that we have to strive to answer, and it's hard.
Right. So put that conversation alongside a conversation around trust in the media. We saw a Gallup poll in the last couple of weeks that showed that over the last 20 years, where we are is not at a historic level of distrust, but I think the moment we're in right now is the second most distrusted moment for our industry. And, there's distrusted institutions broadly. Congress, the courts, the media is not alone in this. But we only own our piece of this. So how do you regain trust? Is that something we should be focused on? And can we regain trust in the communities where actually reality is, as we've just discussed it, a subjective construct?
Yeah, we have to. I mean, first off, of course we're not trusted. We've had a president of the United States every other day for 4 years call us enemies of the people.
It's on him only?
No. But I think that's accelerated. No, it's not on him only. Some of it's on us. We were, in the glory days of print, we were arrogant and we weren't transparent. We didn't explain how we made decisions. We didn't go out into communities that were different. We didn't have diverse newsrooms. We didn't sort of like try to grapple with some of these larger issues. I also have another little pet theory, which I'll try on you, which is that newspapers, and that's the background I came up in, did about a dozen things. 10 of them were anodyne. They told you whether you needed to wear a raincoat. They told you whether or not your team won, and you couldn't watch your team because there were only 3 television stations. They told you whether or not the stock market was up or down. The 10 things that were, and then they pissed you off with editorials, and they pissed you off with harder hitting political coverage. The 10 anodyne things all got taken away. leaving us, I think, a lot with the things that piss people off. But yes, one of our goals is going to have to be to get people to trust us, and that's going to mean getting out in communities,
Right.
being truthful, being more transparent, being more humble, but I think it's got to be part of our mission.
On the question of reporting versus opinion, which you actually called out earlier, you just mentioned editorials that piss people off. I'm going to extend that to endorsements. It's election season. We've just had a round of endorsements in the Texas papers that largely were for a party that almost certainly is not going to win the elections here. And a lot of people in those communities, in fact, reacted negatively, candidly, to editorials on both sides, saying you ought to vote for this person. They say, well, I'm now going to cancel my subscription to the paper. If editorials make people mad, understanding our job in journalism is not to make people happy,
Right.
why are we still doing newspaper endorsements of candidates? Does the New York Times really need people in the city, in its readership, to hear, we think you should vote for Kathy Hochul for governor? Why does that matter? Why is that a good use of the space of the paper? Redirect those resources into reporting.
Well, the good news is I have nothing to do with the opinion part of the paper.
Right, you're
But
freed
let
up
me-
to tell us what you think then.
But let me make the case for opinion and endorsements anyway. I do think that there are people who aren't sure about who to vote for. I do think that's true. And it's easy to say that's not true in the highest profile races like the governor's race, the presidential elections, but those are the highest profile races. I mean, I grew up in a world where there was, city council races were a big deal. So I actually think there's value, and if Katie Kingsbury, who runs Opinion, disagrees with me, that's great. She runs it, I don't. I do think there's value in helping people. Who's gone into a room and looked at, certainly in California, the list of propositions, some of which you don't understand, some of which are described in a way that they're intended for you not to understand. I do think there's a value in newspapers helping you work your way through that on the news side by reporting the hell out of them and what their impact would be, but also on the opinion side and sort of trying to crystallize why one might be better than the other.
But because the world is lacking in media literacy, people conflate the opinion pages with the news pages, and therefore the New York Times is liberal and the Wall Street Journal is conservative. And I could make an argument, I hope credibly, that neither paper is actually its brand on the news side, but it's the opinion pages that are causing you that grief and have caused you that grief forever. Is that a good thing?
Well, some of that is actually self-inflicted. I mean, we've not been great as institutions. We had this beautiful divide in print, right? It was elegant. Everybody knew opinion was wherever your local newspaper put it on, but it wasn't on the front page. We haven't figured out how to do that in the digital space yet. We haven't figured out how to give opinion its proper place versus news. We just haven't figured out how to do that. I think we have to figure out how to do that, and I think we have to be some of this is blocking and tackling. It's hard to tell sometimes. You look at websites, what's opinion and what's news, and we have to do better at that.
So, point of personal privilege, would you talk about the rise of nonprofit news over the last decade plus? You obviously have a lot of people in this room who have thrown in, many of them came from the for-profit press in their communities, with the new economic model to provide this kind of work. You and I were discussing earlier today
that's right.
the value of that, which I think is undeniable over the last decade plus. But talk about that.
Well, it's funny. This is the realm that feels newest to me since I stepped aside as editor of the Times. And as I said, I've spent the last couple months talking to editors around the country. This is the part, in a lot of ways, that's most exciting to me, because they're not going to have to struggle quite as much with the economics of being publicly held companies and shareholders and advertisers. I find that exciting. And some of the coolest newsrooms I've talked with that want to try the most stuff, that are connected to their communities, because you have to be connected to your community if you're not for profit, because you have to raise money in your community. I find that some of the most exciting stuff I've encountered. I've found those newsrooms to be just among the most compelling. I think that whatever the future looks like, there's certainly going to be a bright future for a big part of the future of local journalism is going to be nonprofits, this without question.
You think the quality of the work you see in the nonprofits you look at is up to the level of, again, we've romanticized it out of proportion with reality, but the for-profits in their heyday?
Absolutely. I do. I really do.
Talk about what your brother's getting ready to do. Again, a slight digression from the conversation. You're about to be kin to this space.
That's right. So my younger brother, Terry, who was a senior editor at the Times-Picayune, is the editor of a new nonprofit in New Orleans called Verite. That's going to focus its coverage on income inequality in New Orleans. They literally have just started. I think they're just off the ground the last few weeks, and it's a not-for-profit. They're hiring people now in New Orleans. If they apply for one of our fellowships, I will have nothing to do with it, I promise. So,
But the assumption is that the Times-Picayune, and for that matter, maybe the Baton Rouge paper, I mean, it's really, New Orleans is effectively the capital of the,
that's right.
You know, from a journalism standpoint, New Orleans is what matters for the state. The assumption is that those folks are not doing the job that they need to be doing or cannot do the job adequately enough that we need more oars in the water.
Yeah,
right?
actually, the Times-Picayune does a good job. I think the intention is they can't possibly do what they could have done 25 years ago.
And that's the point, that you're solving a problem, but you're solving a problem in the sense of not saying you're bad, we're good. It's that you can't do as much as you once upon a time could, and so we want to be here to help.
You're also sometimes injecting competition into the water. And look, I always think competition is one of the least examined motivators in journalism, and is a healthy one.
So you mentioned fundraising for these nonprofits, and that it is one of the nice things about all of us in this space, getting the opportunity to spend time in our communities raising money. We, at the high level of these organizations, big, medium, and small, spend a lot of time saying there are a lot of rich people in this country. A lot of wealth is created in this country every year, and the richest Americans got significantly richer during the pandemic. I know because the CEOs of every nonprofit news organization track that every day. And we go out in the communities that we live in to raise money to support our journalism, and it's going well, but it could be going better, and there are many more wealthy Americans who are not supporting this kind of journalism. I know the case that I would make. What's the case that you would make to wealthy Americans why it's important to support this work?
Because independent journalism is good for the democracy. It's good for local communities. It's good for the economics of local communities. And it just makes the world a healthier place, even if they do stuff that pisses you off as a local, rich guy.
Right.
It's better for everybody. If democracy is the wheels of democracy need the fluid of independent journalism that asks hard questions about everything from why is the education system broken? Is the mayor doing a good job? Is the governor doing a good job? What's the economy like? That's absolutely necessary for a functioning democracy.
And do you think everybody along the ideological continuum hears that the same way? I remember once upon a time, maybe year 2 of the Tribune, a political fundraiser was giving me some advice on prospecting off of the political donor list to potentially fund serious nonpartisan journalism. And she said, when you talk to Democrats, talk about journalism. When you talk to Republicans, talk about democracy. Or talk about Texas, because if they hear journalism, they think liberal. That was then. This is now. And I wonder if when you talk about the connection between journalism and democracy in some quarters, what people hear is liberal.
Maybe, though I will point out, frankly, because I think the Texas Tribune is one of the most successful, if not the most successful model of this, I suspect that you have to fundraise across a wide political spectrum.
Confirmed.
Right. So you probably know this better than I do, but as long as the message, I would argue, I've never had to fundraise, but as long as the message is there's a value to independent journalism, whether it's for the democracy or whether it's for journalism or whether it's just for the local community, that's an honorable, true message, whichever button you push. So I would argue that everybody, conservative, liberal, has that's an important value. Yeah. Those are important values.
So we'll go to questions in a bit from the audience. I want to talk to Dean about a couple more things, but prepare yourselves. There are microphones in the aisle. We definitely want to have a lot of time for you to ask questions of Dean. So I've asked you about what happened to investigative journalism. I've asked you about what happened to journalism. Now I'm going to ask you about what happened to the Times. I want to talk about the paper specifically. You don't exactly have distance from it, but you sort of do. You don't exactly have distance from the paper. I mean, you sort of do. You have distance from the job that you used to do. So what are the ways in which you, during your tenure at the paper, left the paper better than you found it? And what are the ways in which you didn't?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's better than we found it in the sense that it's a far better investigative operation than it was, far better. It's better than we found it in the sense that I think it is no longer purely a print newsroom. It's a newsroom that actually experiments, does stuff. It's got, a ginormous podcasting operation and a successful show. It's creating a whole world of visual journalism. I actually think it's become what a large modern news organization should be, and I think one of the results of that is much stronger financially than it was a decade ago. That's the stuff that I think is most. What is not stronger? I don't think we or any other news organization has quite licked the trust issue or has figured it out. I think that's a large question.
Was that something you were focused on and simply you just couldn't get done?
It was something we focused on and didn't fully know how to do it. And we still try. We have a whole group of people working on trust and transparency, but we just haven't figured it out, right? It's like some of the questions of journalism that we face are really big and are going to take a long time. I don't think we figured that out.
So yesterday, you tweeted for the first time in 8 years. Big mistake, by the way.
I don't even want to look at the...
You decided to return to the platform only when Elon Musk bought it. Nice. Nice.
Some people have made that point, by the way.
What you said in your tweet was, I haven't tweeted in 8 years, but I'm so excited to work with the next generation of investigative reporters, apply for the local investigations fellowship, which I'm leading for New York Times. I read the replies. Always a mistake.
I don't read the replies. I don't actually read Twitter much.
I'm going to read you a reply or two here.
Okay.
You should have treated Hillary Clinton more fairly. You did this country a great disservice.
These are relatives, right, of mine. Okay.
We've talked about this before when I've interviewed you previously, but just for the record, because right now, as we get back into the Mar-a-Lago documents question, the response on stage at the Tribune Festival from Karl Rove was literally but her emails. Do you have any regrets? Do you have any regrets about the Times' conduct during that period, which is going to come back up? I can prove it.
Yeah.
Right now.
Look, anytime you look back at your coverage when you don't know how a story is going to end, you wish you had done it differently. That said, there was a federal investigation, a federal criminal investigation of a presidential candidate on the eve of the election, and that is a big story. And to have not treated that like a big story, frankly, at the time, would have been not a journalistic discussion. I will also say what gets lost by some of those critics, and I can always live with the criticism. We were also the first one to report that Donald Trump didn't pay taxes. We were the first ones to write stories about the way how badly he treated women. We did a lot of tough coverage about him in the real estate business, and I think that sometimes in making the case on the former, people forget the latter. Our coverage of Trump was tough enough so that he complained about it, and tough enough so that at the time we were being criticized for being too tough.
Well, it's interesting to me always when people say journalism didn't do its job on telling us who Donald Trump is. The reality is everything we know about Donald Trump is because journalism did do its job.
That's exactly right.
Right? We know that.
That's exactly right.
So on the subject of Trump, I want to ask about the 2024 race as it relates to journalism and specifically to coverage of 2020 and 2016 and what we have learned in that time. Margaret Sullivan, your former public editor, then went on to be a media columnist, I think, for the Washington Post, has written a book called Newsroom Confidential, and she had an excerpt of that book in the Washington Post on October 12th. I want to read you something she wrote and ask you to reflect on this. 6 years later, we journalists know a lot more about covering Donald Trump and his supporters. We've come a long way, but certainly made plenty of mistakes. Too many times we acted as his stenographers or megaphones. Too often we failed to refer to as many falsehoods as lies. It took too long to stop believing that whenever he calmed down for a moment, he was becoming presidential. And it took too long to moderate our instinct to give equal weight to both sides, even when one side, to our earlier conversation, was using misinformation for political gain. She goes on to basically make the argument that we cannot cover Trump if he attempts to regain the White House this time the way we did last time. That's Margaret's point.
She's right.
So talk about that.
She's right. You know, the biggest mistake the press, including the Times, made before was not, first off, nobody took him seriously. We didn't think he could win. The party didn't think he could win. He didn't think he could win. So
In fact, up until 9 o'clock the night of the election, he didn't think he had won.
No, that's right.
Right?
So now he thinks he won this time, even though he lost. But that was not good coverage of him. We didn't realize that the combination of economic anxiety, his appeals to the divisions, including the racial divisions in the country, that all those things would come together to make him someone who could win. So we didn't get that. Of course we get that now, first off. Secondly, I don't think journalists quite knew. We had a world, we had like a, journalism is we can call it whatever it is, but it's also a little bit of a manufacturing plant in that in order to produce lots of journalism every day, we have things we do by rote. And one of the things we do by rote is we quote politicians when they say stuff. And we probably don't challenge them high enough in the story. We've done that for like 1 billion years. So suddenly a guy comes along who's president of the United States. And I do think we took a little bit too long to sort of challenge him. And I do think, of course, we took a little bit too long in understanding that not everything he said was true. I will also say, though, that the first time the New York Times used the word lie on the front page, and we were long before anybody else, was for Donald Trump. And it was before the election, and it was about his lie about where Barack Obama was born.
I do remember that. So speaking of Margaret, one other thing that was in the replies to your tweet, bring back the public editor. I know it's no longer your decision, but should the paper bring back the public editor?
It was never just for the record, the public editor never reported to the executive editor because that would have defeated the purpose. The job of the public editor was to ask me hard questions. So it would be up to the publisher to do it. I do think that it's worth remembering why the public editor's job was created, and it was created before I was at the Times. It was created because after the Jason Blair episode, the Times realized that people did not have a way to make their criticisms of the paper heard. That was the reason it was created. I do not think that's the case anymore. I do think that people who criticize the paper have ways to criticize us. We're aware of the criticism, much more aware of the criticism. So I'm not sure, frankly, that the same circumstances that led to the creation of the public editor a decade ago, whatever, still exist.
So Twitter is the public editor of the New York Times?
I wouldn't say that. The Twitter is part of the formula for the New York Times.
Well, it's definitely a real-time feedback loop, right?
Yeah, but it's not, frankly, it's not always a healthy one.
You don't say. All right, we're going to go to questions. We'll use microphones on either side of the room. We'll go back and forth, and we have about 25 minutes, and you've got an opportunity to ask Dean Baquet questions. I hope you'll take the advantage.
Well, if you have hard ones, you can ask Evan.
Right. Sir.
Thanks. So you mentioned how some aspects of journalism have kind of fallen by the wayside around
Speak up.
I'm sorry, a little bit into the microphone. I apologize.
Okay, great. So you mentioned how like sports scores, stock prices, those elements of local news operations kind of went by the wayside. New York Times is obviously seeing success with games and recipes. I'm curious, what other elements that kind of represent an expanded scope in terms of coverage or business models do you find most promising, particularly as it relates to local news?
Yeah, I love that question. The ancillary stuff that you all are doing now is actually quite successful, right?
And it's also, frankly, the set of, I use the number 10, of those 8 things that we did that when I say fell by the wayside, I mean other people do them better and faster, like the Weather Channel. But I actually think, in a way, the New York Times is trying to reassemble that bundle, if you will. Wordle is the new crossword. Wordle is the new chess column, right? We just bought a sports website that's pretty terrific. That's also part of that idea. I think they're in the middle of beefing up weather coverage because there is with climate change, there is a kind of weather coverage that we actually can do that maybe we can take advantage of visual journalism to do. Those are some that come to mind. Cooking, right? The cooking app and the whole investment in cooking is also part of an attempt to, what does a is there a way to modernize that bundle of stuff that we did 30 years ago and lost some of? What does a modern version of that look like? And those are some of the elements, and I'm sure there are others too.
Thank you. I want to just follow up quickly on that answer on two ways. So the money that you paid for the Wordle has come back. I mean, the Wordle's free, doing it every day for free. It's come back to you in sufficient amount that it was a good investment? Because it was a 7-figure purchase of it.
Yeah, frankly, I don't know the answer to that. I don't literally, because I haven't been in part of the executive discussions in 3 months. But the audience that Wordle brings to the New York Times is certainly worth it.
Why am I, as a digital subscriber to the New York Times since I was this big, not getting The Athletic for free?
You in particular. And
no, I mean, you held the door open. I'm walking through it, man. You said specifically, we acquired this sports journalism site. I agree. It looks awesome.
Yeah.
But I'm not currently paying for it. Why am I not getting it for free?
You know, frankly, I've been out of those. We only acquired it a few months ago, and I've been out of the executive discussions for 3 months. I don't know what the plan is.
Ask AG when you get back.
I
Tell
will,
him I
promise.
I want my Athletic. Sir.
So thinking about the fellowship, or in the same vein of the fellowship, and thinking about the externalities that made journalism, the industry, to be where it is right now, I've found, while speaking to racially and economically minoritized journalists, that an experience in a student newsroom in a K through 12 experience, right, or an English class or a creative writing class was one of the biggest factors of encouraging them to get into journalism, or even getting those skills, right? So I'm wondering, do you think that newsrooms have a responsibility to the K through 12 institutions, right, education-wise? And if so, what do you think that would look like?
You mean, do newsrooms have a responsibility to make sure there's journalism in or to make, help me?
A responsibility to mitigating a lot of for example, a lot of student newsrooms have left, right? The New York Times has a lot of money, but that's in a different conversation.
You know, I'm gonna answer that in a little bit of a I think there is so much work to be done on the current state of professional journalism that I'm not sure we're ready yet to sort of move and figure out the current state of like pre-professional journalism, even journalism school journalism. I think there are like 400 questions that we don't have answers to about what actual professional journalism looks like. That I'm not sure we're ready to jump into a different set of questions, to be honest.
You asked me earlier today what I thought about journalism curriculum, because I mentioned to you that I have a child who is a journalism student at a university. What do you think of journalism curriculum? Forget about pre-journalism school curriculum. Let's talk about journalism school curriculum. Do you think journalism schools are doing a sufficient job of preparing the people we need to populate these newsrooms?
I'm going to steal one thing you said earlier, which I think is true, is that we do need to train the next generation of business leaders in journalism who understand how to figure out not only how to monetize, God, I hate that word, but I couldn't think of another one right off the bat. Not only how to monetize journalism, but how to build audiences. I do think they can do better. But I also am disappointed, frankly, sometimes with the fact that journalism school, my biggest fear, period, and local journalism is part of this, is the erosion of the primacy of reporting. Reporting rules. It just does. Finding stuff out, making your case, getting out in the world, doing the reporting rules. And I sometimes worry when I watch journalism schools and when I look at what some professors say, frankly, on social media, that they don't believe that. And I promise you, if you don't have the reporting, you're not going to have the stuff nobody else has, and you're not going to make it.
Hi.
Hi. This is a question about the investigative fellowship. So, does the proposal need like clear, concrete evidence of wrongdoing already in order for it to be viable? Like, how much pre-reporting needs to be done? Because an issue we've had in our newsroom when applying for these investigative opportunities is that we have kind of an inkling, but the reporter does not have time to fully, delve into it, which is why
Yeah.
we're applying for the opportunities.
Yeah.
And so there isn't that kind of smoking gun yet, but we think that there
Yeah.
might be. Like,
You don't have to have the smoking gun. Look, if you have the smoking gun, that's great, right? But you don't have to have the smoking gun. I think you can. I think if you have an inkling, what I would try to do is, me, Chris, and Sona are actually sitting down with editors and reporters. We may look at an application, sit down with a journalist, and try to figure out if the inkling is a purely uneducated inkling or an inkling based on reality. I mean, some of the finest journalism I've been associated with started out with an inkling. So I think that's enough to have a conversation, to be honest.
okay, we can connect later then.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, I have a question about the selection process around the new local investigation fellowship, because I am from California and I helped work on the statewide dedication for a local fellowship that's coming out of UC at Berkeley, and I'm partnering on how to best kind of strategize how the selection process will look like. And so I'm wondering if part of your selection process is going to be transparent in that you make public how you're selecting these applicants.
It's tricky how transparent you can be, right? You have like 50 people propose, I have these 3 things on the mayor. And you can't be so transparent that you say, we turned down the one where they think they can write about the mayor of city X because we didn't think that they could prove the mayor of city X was corrupt. You want the person who had the idea for the mayor of city X to be able to take it elsewhere. So I think there's a limit to how transparent you can be about the stories. I think you can be transparent about the criterion. You can be transparent about who gets them. I don't think you can reveal sort of the pitches.
I actually wondered if the questioner was going to ask, based on the California reference, if you're striving for geographic diversity in the application pool.
Yeah, we've been beating the bushes, talking to people all over the country to
Right.
make sure that we don't just get applications from,
It's not going to be
New York
6
and
people
LA.
from Fort Lee,
That's
New
right.
Jersey, right? Okay.
Right.
Hi.
I like Fort Lee, though. But
Fort
go
Lee's
ahead.
fine.
I have a question about the institutional knowledge that we're losing, I guess, as newsrooms shrink. And it seems like a lot of investigative reporters have been part of the exodus of newsrooms, larger newsrooms, and have been the backbone of some of these nonprofits that are doing really great work. But as a younger journalist and somebody that has never really had that kind of mentor who has the experience with investigative journalism, it's kind of hard to know where to start when you have a story idea. And I love this program because of that. But where do young journalists who are in a smaller independent newsroom get the skills to start an investigative story, given the liability that comes along with it?
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, well, first off, you just did the best definition of the reason for the program. Frankly, the one thing that I came away thinking from talking to newsrooms is I think that some of us, not just at the New York Times, I would say this to my friends at the Post, the LA Times, I think we should visit newsrooms and help them shape coverage and stories. I think we should try to, this might just be a drop in the bucket, but it wouldn't be a small drop in the bucket. I mean, when I went to the editor of the Baltimore Banner as a friend, and when she invited me and Sona into the newsroom, I would say 80% of what we did had nothing to do with the fellowship. 80% of what we did was I could sit down with them and help them talk about stories. I talked to the City Hall reporter about City Hall coverage. I had time to do it, and I've covered City Hall, and I've covered cops, and I've covered courts. I think we could do a better job of mentoring ourselves, but you just described the whole reason for the program overall.
Hi.
Hi, greetings from the home of the Masters, Augusta, Georgia. I'm Neil Gordon, the publisher of Augusta Business Daily, and our business model is a paywall for memberships and also advertising. We're about a year in. What we haven't quite figured out is whether we're going to push the envelope on our content and do some investigative type stuff. What are your views on investigative reporting as it relates to businesses, whether it be the county and companies doing business or companies maybe not acting ethically in our communities.
You call out corporations as one of the targets of your investigative stuff in the fellowship thing, right?
I mean, there was a if you want to pitch for why you should do investigative reporting, first off, the audience, when we did the Harvey Weinstein stories, it's like, it broke the internet for us. I mean, the audience for investigative reporting is tremendous. I also think we should not just stick to governments and investigative reporting. In a weird way, that started to change in the last decade. In a weird way, one reason people came to believe governments were inefficient and screwed up is because they didn't get a look inside businesses. Now that we've gotten a look inside, businesses, we get that maybe government is not as bad as we thought by comparison. So I would argue, do it. And I would argue, if you're a business publication, do investigative reporting on businesses. It's harder. You can't walk into a local business with a FOIA request and demand stuff. But they too have former employees. They too have lawsuits. They too are regulated. So absolutely, do business investigative.
And quick follow-up, did your memberships go up when you did investigative reporting, your subscriptions? Did it affect it?
Was there a Harvey bump?
The funny thing is I'm so wary about the newsroom. The newsroom should know about audience. I'm so wary of the newsroom being too influenced by subscriptions that I actually don't know. But I know the audience was huge for them. And frankly, the credibility impact, most people don't know this, but Harvey Weinstein was a major advertiser of the New York Times. I never heard from the whole year we were writing about him, I never heard from the advertising department. I never heard from the publisher complaining about it.
I love to hear that. Yes.
This is a Texas-Louisiana question.
Uh-oh. Louisiana, much better. Sorry.
You might remember James Gill of the Times-Picayune.
Oh, sure.
On the editorial page, it's kind of as if every Louisiana politician had an audience of one, which was James Gill, and then James Gill had an audience of millions, which was the state of Louisiana. My question for you is, why doesn't Texas have a James Gill?
That's probably a question for Evan, not for me. James Gill is a tough-minded opinion columnist at the Picayune.
I actually think there have been tough-minded opinion columnists in Texas over the years. We had one for most of 13 years, and he was a co-founder of the Texas Tribune. His name was Ross Ramsey. He retired, but just because he retired doesn't mean there can't be and shouldn't be others who perform the same function. And look, I mean, I think opinion columnists are different to my mind from editorials or endorsements. I mean, I'm not a big fan at the moment of newspapers institutionally telling people what to think, but an opinion columnist properly advertised as such, whether it's James Gill or Ross Ramsey or anybody else, is enormously valuable to this. I think the answer is that right now the state of the media in Texas, broadly defined, is not particularly good. And you've got a lot of hollowed out newsrooms. And as you know, Dean, one of the jobs of people running these things is to stop doing stuff at moments when the economy turns down.
Right.
To try to protect as many, ideally, if you can do it, and if you want to do it, to protect as many jobs as you have. And it may be that some of those functions are a casualty of the environment over the last couple of years. Right?
I will say, by the way, the point you just made, since a lot of you are leaders of the business side as well as the journalism sides of newsrooms, I think the question of what to do and what not to do is a profound and fresh question for us.
Totally agree.
When I started, the answer was in newsroom. I mean, when I first took over as managing editor of the LA Times, I had a newsroom of 1,200. The answer was, well, we'll just do everything. You can't do everything. The new nonprofits that have, even the ones that have 20 or 30 people, even I'm sure this is a debate at the Tribune, right? What's your identity? What are you not going to do? And man, I will tell you, when a news story breaks, if it's on a list of things you've decided not to do, that is really hard. It's really hard not to do it.
Right. There's the former editor of one of the big papers in Texas, lamented to me a couple years ago after another round of cuts at his paper that we used to be a newsroom of record, now we're a newsroom of choice. He said the problem is that the community still wants us to be a newsroom of record, but we don't have the resources necessary to do all the things that the community wants us to do.
Those are those conversations, by the way, you could almost devote a day to how do you make those choices? Right. How do you make them honorably? How do you make them that gives a nod to your audience? just how do you make the choices about what to do and what not to do? That's like something we've never had to contemplate because we did everything 20 years ago.
And even the Times, with all of its resources and
Can't do
successes, still
everything.
can't do everything.
That's
So,
right.
Yes.
Hi, my question has to do with trust, and you guys talked about opinion pieces and endorsement pieces and how they can be polarizing and piss people off, and I think you made a really good case for why we should do them. But there was a headline I saw in the Times recently about Tom Brady and Ron DeSantis being on texting terms, and I don't believe it was an opinion piece. I could be wrong about that, but I wonder, like, if there's an issue with the framing of that story, and even, is that even a story? And, like, some would say that that's in your reporting, not an opinion piece, but just that there's framing issues and story selection. So can you talk about your thoughts on that and why or why not?
Yeah, I missed that story. So I don't know whether it was an opinion piece, and I don't know what the story was about. I do think framing is like a difficult question, right? And I actually think that sometimes I think there's too much emphasis on framing at the expense of reporting. But if your question is it a legitimate story? And again, I hadn't read the story. Is it a legitimate story that Tom Brady, who has been known to have relationships with various politicians, including the former president, I think that's a legitimate story. I don't know if that's what that story was, but I think that's a legitimate story.
Okay, thanks.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Denise Lockwood. I own the Racine County Eye in Racine, Wisconsin, which is actually the news website, was the first website to say that Foxconn was coming to Mount Pleasant, which is just adjacent to us. You guys covered it quite a bit. So one of the things that was kind of a challenge for me, and I think this is where my question towards like where we can go with collaboration with smaller local news organizations like mine, which has all of like 4 to 5 people, and partnering with larger news organizations. So like, here's an example. When you guys did a story about where things were going with Foxconn, you used my freelance photographer, which was great. No worries on that. But like, it was really great. Sure.
This is not going to this is not going to end well for you. No, this is not going to end well for you. Not at all.
No,
just prepare
but
yourself.
One of the spots that was like, I read your story, and this was several years ago, so it's still like, there were like some pieces, some minutia. No, it's cool. It's all cool. It's cool. But I think this is where we could do some really great stuff, and being able to really have that synergy. There's like such a wall between the big mom and pop, pop and pop, and the big ones. And I think there's a lot of opportunity that we could really, like, the institutional knowledge that we have, because I've been addicted to journalism for 22 years.
Yeah.
And I live here, and so like, you guys weren't in like the construction permit process like I was nerding out on, and like saying that Foxconn wasn't where we were supposed to be when they just finished like $1.2 million in like infrastructure was kind of like, well, okay. So I want to know like what else can we be doing? And I think the investigative journalism piece is so great, but like there's so much more that we could be doing, and I think there's some conversation that we could have around that.
I do, and Evan and I talked about this morning. I do think that the major local news organizations, and I'll get to the Times in a second, if I were running a local news a major daily, I would be more than willing to cooperate with and work with some of the new players in journalism. I just would. I think there's great stuff being done. I think the New York Times, there's no moral reason for the New York Times not to do it. We should do it more. And frankly, it's been helpful that I'm getting out and meeting other editors that I can introduce. It's hard to do it on news stories logistically. Remember when I said we're a manufacturing plant? It's hard to like know, like hundreds of news organizations, who's got it, who's the editor, who to call. It's just hard, but there's no reason not to try.
You understand that it may be hard, but it has the effect in local news of feeling like the Times is bigfooting.
Totally, I get it.
Local news organizations.
Yeah, I've been on the other, just for the record, I've been on the other side of that feeling.
Yeah.
I mean, I started out in New Orleans, and even when I was in Chicago and LA, and I don't think that's good for the Times. It's hard to do. Look, one of the other things that's happening as I work on this program is I'm sitting in newsrooms and I'm hearing, first off, I want to sell people a little bit on the Times, not to subscribe to, but on the fact that we're coming into this with humility and we're saying, tell us what we need to do better at. And I'm hearing stuff like that, and it's been really helpful.
Great. I'm just heads up to the people in line for questions. We have 4.5 minutes left. We'll get to as many as we can, but I don't know that we're going to get to everybody. Sir.
I was thrilled by your statement that nobody is objective, but give us some advice as we go around raising money to be nonprofit journalists. What kind of language do you use? Do you use fair and balanced? Do you use accuracy and truth? I mean, so I'd like to have you take a crack at that for us.
I've never had to raise money, so Evan should jump in here too. But I like independence more than objective, because objective has gotten so, it's gotten to be such a hot button word. I use independence, because independence brings with it the idea that you're independent of any party, you're independent of any politician, you're independent of any business industry, and you are willing to call it out. After you do the reporting, you're willing to call people out when you can call them out. So I like the word independence.
I would absolutely second that. I talk about our work as reliable, credible, independent journalism. There was a time that we talked about ourselves as nonpartisan. I will tell you that I'm not sure that word means anything right now. I will also tell you that we did a fairly comprehensive audience survey over the last year at the Texas Tribune, where we discovered that the word nonpartisan did not have any resonance with the audience that we serve, but that independence did. And to Dean's point, independence means without fear or favor.
That's
Pull
right.
no punches, but hit both cheeks.
That's right.
If you're only holding one side accountable, we say you're doing it wrong.
That's right.
And so you got to be independent of anybody and anything, including your sources of funding, and willing to take their heads off if that's what journalism requires.
That's right. If I can amplify one thing, when I said nobody's objective, which I meant to and I stick with, if you read the history of objectivity, and there are histories of objectivity, objectivity was in fact an acknowledgement. When Walter Lippmann and others started pushing for it, it was an acknowledgement that nobody was objective and that you needed to build a system inside newsrooms called editing to make sure that whatever baggage you had that got in the way, as opposed to the baggage you have that helps you, whatever baggage you had that got in the way didn't get in the way.
Hi, I'm Noe Magana with Bonita Link out of California. So we cover a rural county. So we have maybe difficulty attracting competent reporters. So on a general base, how does journalism as an industry compete with other industries such as technology, which is really big and obviously in California? Like, how do we get competent reporters, young people to be motivated to go that route instead of what we call maybe the easy money in the technology industry?
If you're talking about journalists as opposed to people who work in tech?
Sort of the salary comparisons in between industries.
Gotcha. I mean, look, frankly, anybody who, I spoke to two journalism classes last week, and there are a lot of motivated journalists out there. I don't think the issue is convincing people to become journalists, frankly. I think your issue probably is convincing people to be journalists in places that are less glamorous. And Report for America has done a lot in that regard. But I met with a journalism class at Columbia, and I said, all of you who get a chance to get the hell out of New York, get out of New York. Go to work in Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Oklahoma. You're going to learn a lot. You're going to do great stuff, and you're going to change the profession. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, we have 22 seconds left, but I'm going to just say, Emily, we're going to take both these questions because these women have been very kind in standing up and waiting. So I want to go ahead and take both. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Emily Sacker. I'm the former education and transportation writer for New York Newsday back in the 90s before that paper folded. Thank you.
I think we've met. Okay.
I think we have. I want to thank you, by the way, for coming to this conference and for the humility that you've shown in your leadership of the Times.
Thank you.
So 30 years later, I'm now a grandma and the founder of a tiny upstate newspaper, really Hudson Valley newspaper covering Rhinebeck and Red Hook. My question for you is, where do you see the distinction between single issue publications and little small town papers like the one I'm running? Where is the sustainability model in those two? Where do you think journalism is going in terms of those two different directions?
All of the above, frankly. I do think that, Evan and I were talking about this morning. I do think that single issue, if you have a small staff, and a lot of this depends on geography, right? And you can focus on a single issue, if you have 5 reporters and you're in Los Angeles, you can't be a general interest publication, right? You're gonna get killed, and your reporters are gonna riot. You gotta think, what are the 1 or 2 things that we can do that the big dailies can't do, where we can have expertise and nail it. So that's what I would say if you're in that kind of community. If you're in a smaller community, you actually can come closer to being a general interest publication. Frankly, I think both have futures. I think the future is going to look wild and crazy and sort of cool, right? Not-for-profit, single-issue publications. Publications that only cover education in LA. Publications that only cover, the city council someplace. I think it's going to be cool and exciting. That answers.
Great. Last question, ma'am.
As a small independent news organization, and we cover regular stuff, and we break a story, then you get the parachute effect of a local broadcast station coming in, literally elbowing their way in. Broadcast people are very rude. How do you handle that? Like when you say, I had that story first. I recently interviewed a lady who escaped Ukraine with her daughter. I had a relationship with her sister who owns a restaurant nearby. So next thing I know, the channel, all the stations are coming in, but not giving me the credit of breaking the story. And they do that also with city council meetings when something breaks out, and all of a sudden they get wind of it, and they're there.
I would say 2 things. I would say complain to the bigger news organization that sort of goes in and takes the story. But I would also distinguish between cases where you were the first one to raise an issue and other people then raise, as opposed to a true scoop. But I think if you have a scoop that deserves to be credited and doesn't get credited, I would call and complain, and I would just be a pain in the ass. And after 5 calls, they'll start giving you credit. But make sure you distinguish between scoops, where my definition is the thing would not have been known had you not reported it, versus cases where you just got there a day earlier and it's not quite as clear.
Everybody, we're lucky to have Dean Baquet give us so much of his time. Come to Austin, give Dean Baquet a big hand.
Thank you.
Thank you again to the organizers. We'll see you soon.